Hi, everyone. So, today I wanted to start off the first of what I hope will be a couple of different videos in a series here, kind of going through my summer project this year. I'm kind of thinking about this as letting you guys kind of see the different steps that I need to go through, kind of start to finish, from the planning stages to the acquisition side, all the way through processing or pre-processing, and then final, processing in the image. So to start off with, I do most of my work in terms of planning and acquiring the images inside of Sequence Generator Pro. You can use a variety of tools for this. I've seen some neat things from Nina lately. I've used Prism in the past. There's a lot of different tools that'll help you out with this planning aspect of it. But for me, normally I will find a target either online or through an app somewhere that I think is really neat, that looks like it might be up around this time of year. And then I kind of take a look at what it might look like in my process. So to start with, I'm going to go ahead and start a new sequence. And I'll say new sequence with profile. In my case, I have several different profiles set up for my telescope at different focal lengths or things like that. And for this particular project, I wanted to go with the f5 because I did want to get kind of a moderate level of close-up nature on the different pieces of what we're going to be looking at here. So we'll go ahead and say the f5 one. Go ahead and click OK. And that's going to give me a nice blank sequence template here with the right hardware and that kind of thing. But a big part of what this will do for me is I have saved for the camera essentially the field of view. So if you're in Sequence Generator Pro and you put an equipment profile together, right under the camera tab you have this scale marker here, and this is something you should definitely have filled in. The angle, read noise, less really critical, at least for what I've worked with, but the scale is an important one to have in there. And the reason why is what we're going to look at next. So now I know this is the equipment I'm dealing with. I want to go take a look at the object and see how I might want to frame this up for my project. So for that, I'm going to go to Tools, and then I'm looking at the Framing and Mosaic wizard. I really, really like this tool. It does, if I remember correctly, require an internet connection to fetch the data that it's doing. So keep that in mind. You definitely want to do your planning before you're out there in the field imaging. You only need it for kind of this planning part. As far as the internet goes, after that, it just saves it all to the target. So in my case, I'm going to be looking at the Veil Nebula. And after, so you can even use an image that you find online. You can put in the RA and DEC coordinates specifically there. For me, I am going to spell or misspell the actual target there, and then you put in the field of view that you want to look at. This is how big of kind of a result it's going to show you. In my case, I'm going to go ahead and say I want it to be 8 degrees because I want to look at the whole area around the object and get an idea of what's there, because that will help me determine the appropriate kind of framing, sizing, focal length, that kind of thing. And then before I hit fetch, I'm also just kind of double checking this camera info. I know it says define the camera info here first. I kind of like to do it before I hit fetch, just to make sure. And that 1.474 was the same that was under my profile. So I'm going to go ahead and hit fetch. And this can take quite a while if it's a big image. It didn't take any time at all for me because I've already run this fetch before. So it kind of already had the image kind of saved in the temporary area. And once the image is up, I don't need the main sequence window up. So I'll close that up there. And first thing is, you'll notice for different parts of this, the image can be kind of hard to see. It's giving you the full unstretched histogram there. So normally I will kind of bring this in a little bit to taste. Now this isn't meant to be the the same quality image that you would get on your own. You can tell this are kind of automatically quickly stitched together kinds of things, but it gives you a real good idea of the general placement of the objects. So now I've got the target there, and I can start zooming in on it a bit. It's going to be pretty low res in here because I've put the field of view so high. If I had put it smaller, then it would show a little bit smaller. But I know a lot of people will take, you know, the witch's broom part of the veil here, or maybe the eastern veil there, and those are all fantastic targets. For my project, I really wanted to get the whole area, right? This whole area is one large supernova remnant, right? And I wanted to get an image that encompassed all of it. But I also, you know, when I was thinking about it, I didn't want to sacrifice the detail on getting a nice image of the witch's broom or the eastern veil. You know, how can I have my cake and eat it too there? Well, it turns out if you're willing to just put in more time and effort into it, you can certainly have your cake and eat it too by doing a mosaic of the whole area. And that's really what I opted to do. Instead of going for a shorter focal length so I could get a bigger field of view and just get a snapshot of the whole thing, I decided I wanted to do a mosaic here. How do I know that I need to do that? Well, now that I have the target here and that scale and pixel value of the sensors put in, I can just drag on the screen, start creating a box, and when I let go, it's going to give me a box there that is the size of the field of view for this camera. So I can drag it around and see, you know, oh wow, you know, one frame of a field of view of this camera works really well for framing up, you know, the eastern veil there. If I come down here, oh hey, that's pretty good for the witch's broom there too. But obviously I can't really get them both in this image. So the answer is really a mosaic. So go ahead and subtract out here, minus out a little bit, zoom out. And so now I want a mosaic. How big a mosaic do I need to get? Well, the step 3 on this, like I said, drag it on there to create the area, and then you can kind of rotate around. I find the rotation sometimes you end up doing after you figure out the mosaic, but let's leave it like this for now. And then the next part is, okay, how many tiles in this mosaic do I want to have? So if I just go ahead and add to this number, so now I've got a 1x2 mosaic here. And if I'm looking down this way, it's okay. That's getting closer. You know, depending on rotating this around, maybe I can fit it in. But I know I want to go up more, so I'm going to say, okay, give me a 2x2 here. And now we're getting a lot closer. Now, in this case, one important thing to note is there's this overlap percentage here. That's how much each one of these, you know, single frames needs to overlap with the one next to it, above or below it. So let's say I did a 10% overlap. You can see all of a sudden my overall box gets much, much bigger, right? And it's just something you'll need to kind of figure out. In general, doing something like a 5% overlap probably isn't recommended, because most of the time when you're taking images, you're going to do dithering, right? So the telescope is going to move itself a few pixels either way, you know, each time you're taking an image, and that can eat into your overlap here. And especially if you want a nice smooth mosaic at the end of the day, you know, you really want to leave yourself enough room there of kind of shared data on either side. So I've seen a lot of places recommending 25. I think, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I think I went with 15 for this one here. We'll see how well it matches up when I'm redoing it here. But so now I've got this, and this almost fits, right? I got some stuff. I'd love to be able to get these wispy bits out on the side here. It almost fits. That's where our rotation starts coming into play. So with that, let me just turn it all the way upside down, since I think most of us like seeing the witch's broom kind of at the top here. At least I do. I'm going to start bringing this down, and let's see how close we're getting. Well, we're getting pretty close. I'd like to do is say, well, what if we treated, which part of this looks the most square-like to me? And for me, I was thinking about this coming through here. And once I do this, now we've got an image that, now it's just barely. If you like more blank space, then you may need more tiles than I'm using here. But for me, it seems to encompass the whole area pretty nicely into a final image there. But at the same point in time, because I'm taking these individual, higher focal length exposures for it, I can always crop my final images to get more on some of these individual pieces at a higher detail if I want. So that kind of lets me do both. But that does mean I'm going to need to take a series of images for number 1, 2, 3, and 4 here. So, that is more manpower. And the other part is, how do you then make sure that you will take images at the exact spot? If you're hand aiming your scope, that's not going to work, and it probably won't even work if you're just using, your average kind of planetarium program to kind of point you in the right area. You really need to be able to precisely go to these spots, and that's what Sequence Generator Pro really makes pretty easy here. So now that I have these lined up, the 1, 2, 3, and 4, I can just go ahead and say, let's create the sequence. And I'll come up here and say, let's give it a name. I'm going to go ahead and just leave it as Veil Nebula. Do I want to append it or replace it? I'll say replace, because the blank one that's in there isn't anything. Auto rotate or validate rotation on Mosaic start. If you are just using this to pick a particular target, and maybe that target's pretty small in here, you may not need this turned on. Maybe you don't need to rotate your camera around to get the framing just right. Or maybe you don't have a good way to rotate your camera around, in which case you could leave that off. However, if you're going to do, a multi-panel mosaic like this, it's really important to be pretty close on your rotation, because that overlap line is really critical to making sure that you've got a nice, seamless picture at the end of the day. So I'm going to leave that checked on. Then what do we want to do once we go to that target? Well, I pretty much always leave it on the precision centering with plate solve. If you look at my previous video on plate solving, it'll kind of walk you through how to set that up. And that's really going to be the best way to make sure that whenever it goes to each one of these, it will be dead on where you need it to be, and you really don't have to worry about it to make sure that you're going to be taking pictures of the right thing. And then the last one is associate working image with sequence. I like to do this. It's probably not required, but because it will put in the RA and deck for each one of these into the target. But I like to do it because it lets me look back at my plan at any point in time. So once I click OK, success, we've created 4 new targets. And then it'll pop me back over into my sequence list, and you can see that Veil Nebula is turned now into 1, 2, 3, and 4, and those line up with my 1, 2, 3, and 4 here. So great. Now I have kind of the first part of the plan in place. So for the next part of the plan, we need to move from the actual kind of layout of this into the execution. How do we actually go ahead and take the images for this? So the first thing that you're going to want to do is determine how much time and image kind of effort you're going to put in on each one of these. Now, in my case, I'm dealing with a monochrome camera with a filter wheel. If you're dealing with a color one-shot camera, this might be a whole lot easier than what I'm about to show you, or at least less of the same thing. But so let's start by saying, well, what kind of frames do I need to take here? So the first kind of decision for me is, for a given target, especially if I'm doing monochrome imaging, which filters do I want to use? The Veil Nebula tends to be very faint, especially in suburban kind of environments like I have. So, really, for me, the best way to do this is to take this as narrowband. So, then I start thinking about, okay, which narrowband filters do I want to do? Well, hydrogen alpha is normally the easy choice. And then after that, many targets work well using the S2 and the O3 filters. But this particular nebula, and if you look out online on a lot of the different pictures that are out there, there really isn't much in the S line, on the sulfur side. So most of the images are really, most of the really good images, a lot of them really just take the hydrogen alpha and then the oxygen 3. and they will combine that together into what's called a bicolor image. And that's really kind of what I'm going for on this one. So in that case, I'm going to set up, I'm going to put 2 little run check boxes just to kind of start me off as my guide. And then my first one is I want my hydrogen alpha filter, and then I'm going to want my O3 filter. So now, going down the line here, the next question would be how long of an exposure do I need to take? And there's a few different questions you need to ask yourself there, and that's really going to vary camera to camera. You know, as you've taken more shots, you'll get more comfortable with what exposure levels work well with your particular filters and in your particular environment. In my case, for my ASI 1600 camera, I really kind of wanted to go for a decent dynamic range, but not be exposing for, 30, 40 minutes at a shot, that kind of thing. So for me, the middle ground on this was to do 5-minute long exposures. And then with the 1600, because it's a CMOS camera, I can come in and set a particular gain. So if you think of it kind of like ISO for a DSLR, gain 0 is kind of like that ISO 100, and this can go all the way up to gain 300 or 350, which is the very, very high kind of ISO. So 0 gives you the best dynamic range, isn't necessarily the best on noise. So after doing a lot of research on this camera, and what I've noticed in my images has worked well, I'm going for 75 gain. An offset is just kind of a minimum boost pedestal given to all of the values, to keep it off the very bottom floor of 0 when collecting data. It just kind of helps make sure that every electron that came in you did something with. So 75-15 is my general go-to for my f5 version of the scope and at 5 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK on that. And then I'm going to do the same setting on the other one, 75 and 15. Click OK. All right, so now I've got my gain setting set up right. I'm going to run these. Those are the filter values, HA and O3. I'm going to do 5-minute exposures each. Binning, for this camera, bin everything one by one. It can do different binning levels, but because it's CMOS and it's doing software binning instead of hardware, you normally don't get that much benefit live in the camera with it, other than a little bit smaller file size. Plus, as I said, my goal is to have higher resolution, so I don't really want to bin it. So how many frames am I going to take? That's really what the repeat is. So a lot of times I'll start off with something like 25 if I was just doing one target. But remember, everything you're doing here is then going to multiply by 4, because you're having to do this for each panel of the mosaic. So the number of frames here is going to add up pretty quick. So if I just do 25, that's 50 for this one, 100, 150, 200 frames. And that's a lot. If you're doing a big project like this, you kind of have to commit to, this is not a one evening thing, like more likely than not. Plus, the way Sequence Generator works most of the time, unfortunately, I'm not setting it. I could set it up this way if I wanted to, but I'm not doing like all of my HA for all the targets one night and then all of my O3 another night. So it's changing focuses or refocusing between these filters and moving the telescope around. So it is a time-consuming process. Now, in my case, I think 25 is good for just the planning purposes here. I think I'm going to run 30 or 40 frames in the actual project, but we'll go ahead and set this up for here. So I can fill all that in again, and Lord knows I've done that many times. But one of the things that's really nice in Sequence Generator here is once you get one of these targets set up the way you would want it to be, you can then just kind of right-click on it, come down here where it says copy events to and from. We're going to copy events to all 3 of the other ones, or you could do the select all there. You sure? Yep. And then once it copies those events over, you notice you come down here, and now I've got the exact same setup. Even in the event settings, it's also filled in my event gain and event offset for me. So that's all fantastic. So now I have a shooting plan, right? I have all 4 of the panels in here, and I've got them set up for my exposures and durations and all that kind of good thing. So, I'm ready to go, right? Well, yes and no. You could go out here and shoot it and kind of do that by eye, but in my backyard, I'm shooting with the telescope kind of sitting on my back patio, which means that on the eastern view of the telescope is the side of my house. So I kind of can't take a picture of anything that's directly east of me until it gets to be about 45 to 50 degrees on the horizon. So I need to make sure that I'm doing that. And in this case, at least this particular time of year, that's 11:30 at night. I may not want to be out there watching the scope at all of that time to make sure it's ready to go. And I can't do things like plate solving until it gets over my house. So I need to set up timing on when this stuff is going to start and stop. So going back to Veil Nebula 1, I'm going to go ahead and open up this settings icon here. And then you can see down at the bottom, it's got time constraints. So let me do a start and end on this. So I'm going to just turn those on, and it'll say start at minus 27 degrees, which is where it is right now. It's a little low at minus 27. But what I can do is start to say, okay, let's bring up that degree marker. So as I mentioned before, about 45 degrees or so. Well, you can see it jumped over to 6. And this will make sense more in just a second. But why does it do that? And what's the actual time I want to start on? Well, there's a neat link for planning tools here. When you click on that, let me scoot this up. It's a little bit easier to see. When you click on that, it's going to show you for that target that you have in the RA index that's in here. Here's where it is in the sky, how high it is at any point in time in the night. And then it'll also show you the bands of, sunset and sunrise, that kind of thing. So that 44 degrees or 45 degrees there, well, there's another 44 or 45 earlier in the evening. And SGP just has a problem sometimes of skipping between them. So this planning tool can be really nice to say, let's go to 45 degrees. I'm just going to mouse up until I see that down in this little area here. 45 degrees. And it says that's at about 11 p.m. What I can do is just normal click, and that'll set that time to be there. Well, what about ending it? I'd like to go to sleep, and I don't want to have to wake up at 5 a.m. to make sure I stop everything. So from here, I'm just going to kind of run my way down and look at, okay, it looks like the sun's going to start coming up over here. Well, we actually have a tool that'll tell us more about that right underneath here. So you've got sunrise, sunset, which is great, but dawn and dusk is a little bit better for trying to actually have the sky decently dark. So I'm going to look, dawn is at 5:09. So I'm going to go ahead and try to be under 5:09. So 5:06 right there. And then I right click, and right clicking puts the end time in. So normal click for start, right click for end, just like it shows here. And I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now I have a nice start and end time for this particular target. Now I've got a nice start and end time. And luckily my target's also pretty decently up above the horizon in good shooting range for all of that time. And that's great for this one. I need to put it on the other ones as well. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And let's go and do the same thing for Veil Nebula number 2. All right, so now I've got them all in there. But something to keep in mind, especially when you're doing a mosaic, is that even though this is one part of the sky, depending on your field of view, it might be a pretty big part of the sky that you're looking at. So our Veil Nebula 1 is this shot here. And as we saw, that 45 degrees, which is what I need to clear the top of my house, happens at 11:11. Or at that point, it's in good shape, which is great. However, if I look at the Veil number 3, which is up above it, and remember I was doing this by degrees, it's 11:01 here. So if you want to maximize your time spent imaging on these, it would make sense to start taking pictures of 3 and 4 a little bit before 1 and 2, because these are a little bit higher up in the sky by a few minutes. And honestly, a few minutes sometimes can count. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and say I want 3 and 4 to happen before 1 or 2. So I'm going to use these little arrows to move 3 and 4 up. So now I've got 3, 4, 1, 2, and that may feel, for those of us that have a little bit of OCD, that may feel a little rough to be out of order, but it does, help give me a little bit more time. So now I've got these in this order. They can certainly start at that time, and if I want to, I can be good to go from here. Let it run through. But what's going to happen is, because each of these has the full start and end time kind of in there, this 6 hours worth of imaging here, it's going to go through and take 6 hours of this target, and then if that lets it finish all this, great, it'll move on and start taking 6 hours of the next one, etc., etc. And that can cause some problems at the end of the day when you're trying to put your mosaic together, because your screen brightnesses, or not screen brightness, your background sky brightness may be pretty different night to night on a lot of these, which might make it a little bit harder to seamlessly match them up. The way that I have chosen to get around it for this project is, instead of trying to take all 25 in one night for a particular target, then move on to the next one, is I might say I'm going to try to take 10. So once I put 10 in, and this is where I'm saying, sometimes you do come in and edit each step of the mosaic a little bit here and there. I could still copy it around, but I like punching them in sometimes. So I'm going to say 10, 10, and then once we add the other 10 and 10 in. All right, so now I have that in there, and if I look at the overall sequence status, you'll see it's saying 6 hours and 45 minutes. Well, that's definitely longer than my about 5 hours worth of total time that I have. And this isn't taking into account the full time spent dithering, refocusing the telescope, slewing the telescope around for the different points, or changing filters. So I want to go ahead and try to add in, have enough buffer time in there. So maybe 10 is too much. So let's try 5. So I'm going to do that on this one, and then this time I will take advantage of the copy too. So copy that to all of the other ones. All right, now that it's done that, you can see that is only 2.5 hours. Okay, well, that's better, but that's half of my imaging time. I'd probably like a little bit more in there. I probably not spending half of my imaging time dithering. So let's bump this up maybe to, say, 7. And we'll just test it again and see what it does for us here. All right, so now we're at 3.5 hours out of, and let's use the one that comes up latest, because that probably has the best, the most narrowed in time. So 3.5 hours out of about 5:45. So I still got some more time there. So I think in this case, let's go ahead and do 8 on everything. Just trying to maximize it in, and you'll go back and forth on this kind of stuff and dial it in several times to kind of get an idea. And no matter how good you get at it, there'll be nights that you finish a little early and nights that you didn't quite get every single frame in there. But so now we're looking at 4 hours versus that 5 and change there. So this feels right. This feels like I've got enough slack in the time here that I should be able to get most, if not all, of the images that I wanted to get in a single night. And then what'll happen is I'll run this on one night, and then I can come back in and just right click on this and say reset progress for the next night and run it all again, right? And then at that point, I'm kind of building up an even smattering of frames for each piece of this mosaic. And then it kind of becomes up to me of when do I decide to call it quits? Is 8 frames per mosaic piece enough? If I had another night, I can get to 16. Is 16 good? Do I want to, and just kind of run up in those increments until I go maybe 30 is good, or 40 is good, or I just got to 25, which isn't bad, and it looks like it's going to be 2 solid weeks of rain. So I'm just going to process everything I have now and see how it goes. So this method of doing it can give you a little bit of that kind of slack instead of starting a project and it takes you 2 days to get through the first panel here, and then you lose interest and never follow through on it. So now that I have this sequence together, outside of shooting it, there's one very important last piece here, and that's that I want to save it. Right now it's not titled, so I want to go ahead and say save sequence as, and I want to give it a name. By default, it's going to put in the first name on the thing here. I'm going to call this temp project because I already have a real project one. And then let's save. So now I've got that in there. If I close up Sequence Generator Pro, open it back up, I can load the sequence. I would always encourage, even if you did have the all your equipment on here, when you open the sequence, there's the Apply Profile to Sequence button, which will let you pick your particular profile. I would always do that to make sure that you've got the right equipment on there, and in case you've made any little changes to your auto guiding, focusing, etc., it'll make sure that it all applies back here. And then at that point, we're pretty much ready to go. We've figured out what we want to shoot. We separated out into the right number of panels in order to cover the whole area. We've gone ahead and moved that in there with very precise coordinates built in so that we can use that plate solving capability to go dead on to it. I should point out we also have the camera rotation right here. If you happen to have a precise rotator, this is great. You can hook that up and it'll pass it along. If you don't, what'll happen is in that plate solving process, it'll bring up a little dial showing you how many degrees you are off from the target in either clockwise or counterclockwise. And you just loosen up whatever's holding your camera from rotating, rotate it a little bit, put it back in, and you iterate on that a couple times. And then you're on, and that was also covered in that plate solving video that I did as well. So, it really isn't too hard to get that rotation set up just right. So we've got the rotation in there. We've decided how many frames we're going to take, what exposure length, the filter type, as well as, in my case, the gain and offset settings that we need. And we're ready to go ahead and take this particular session out on the road. And that's what I've been doing for the last few days. I'm going to go ahead and kind of end this video with this. It's a lot on how to go through your planning setup. Hopefully this will be helpful to you. My next video in the series will kind of start taking a look at some of the images that have been coming in, how those are coming together, as well as the beginning stages of trying to fit these things together into a mosaic that hopefully doesn't look like a quilt and looks more like an image that was all meant to be taken together. So that's it for now. Until next time, I wish everybody clear skies. Thanks.